Finally, Chapter 24, the last chapter of the book, An Introduction to ASP.NET MVC. So this chapter is, at the end, it's probably one of the more advanced. I mean, the last three chapters have all been advanced topics, but this is another one that's got a lot of meat to it. So we're going to briefly go over everything, introduce it, but later in the class site, I'll actually put up some more links, some additional materials for learning even more about ASP.NET MVC. One chapter it's great for an intro, but there's really, we're just going to touch on a whole bunch of things that we just don't have time to go into detail of every little detail. So, what are we going to talk about? We're going to, excuse me, go over the basics of Model View Controller, the MVC design pattern. That's the whole point of the chapter. We'll talk about how it, why it can improve application performance. It helps teams work better. It adds testability. So we'll talk about all those things. We'll talk about this idea that there's not only model view controllers, there's also a thing called a view model. I'll mention that. We'll talk about how they all relate. The order that you develop them. We'll talk about the Razor View engine and how that applies to ASP.MVC. We'll talk about some HTML helpers. These are HTML controls that help us to generate HTML. We'll talk about redirection, so other ways that we can redirect pages to in ASP.MVC. And finally, we'll talk about strongly typed views and model binding and how that can help make our code even more cleaner in ASP.NET MVC. Excuse me. All right, so what is this MVC you speak of? The idea is that previously in what we've been doing in ASP.NET, we've been using web forms, which is great for internet applications and having session state and rapid application development, but it does have some lacking features, such as it's not very testable. If you actually wanted to write automated tests, code tests, where you wanted to do test-driven design or TDD, web forms are not well suited for that. So this MVC pattern, it breaks things up into areas of concern. You've got a model code that is strictly for dealing with the database. You've got views that are strictly for dealing with the client display of the data. You've got a controller that is strictly the middleman. He fetches stuff from the model, sends it to the view, but the controller doesn't deal with presenting data. It doesn't talk to the database directly. It does receive HTTP requests, but then it's the middleman for these two guys. Now, sometimes what people do, this is optional, but they'll actually take and they'll have a separate subclass, if you will, that deals with some of the it's called a view model that handles some of the pulling some of that information from the controller to the view. So that's another sometimes implementation, but these are the main three: the model view controller, and they have different areas of concern for as far as data is concerned. And the reason that's good is because we break them up into different areas, it makes it much more easy to test. It also makes it much more easy to develop. If I've got a team of developers with web forms, you had a page, an ASPX page, and then you had code behind page, but they were very tightly integrated together, and it was hard to put more than one person on developing. You couldn't say, hey, you go change the ASPX and someone else will change the ASPX.cs file. That really didn't work too well. But with this, since we've separated everything out, it makes it easier for different people to work on different areas of the application. And it's just everything I just said. Okay. So again, to recap the benefits, better separation of concerns, easier to assign a designer just to the views and a developer just to the controller, more concise, easier to integrate with JavaScript and jQuery for better page load performance. MVC is better suited to the stateless nature of HTTP, so there's less overhead when you're trying to replicate state. So all sorts of performance improvements. That said, I would caution, when MVC first came out, people thought, oh, it's a replacement for web forms. Let's just stop all the web form development and let's do MVC. But that hasn't proven to be the case. I think web forms still have a solid place. A lot of not only do a lot of people know web forms, but even just learning web forms, it's easier to get started with web forms. I think you can put something together pretty quickly with web forms. So we'll see in my demo in a minute here that it's not that hard to get started from a point-and-click nature of MVC. The problem with MVC is that it is, once it may be easy to get started, but then after you get started, there's a lot of code, and you actually you get advanced pretty quick. So, but there's still, like, excuse me, the point I'm trying to make is that MVC is not necessarily a replacement for web forms. It's complementary to it. All right, so in the book on book apps, chapter 24, they do have a shopping cart application. So they've taken the Halloween store that we've been looking at all throughout the book, and they've added a bit of an MVC application. I don't think it's finished. They've only done a few different pieces, but just to give us a taste of what it might look like. And let me actually show you that. Let's go out to Visual Studio. Let's open up that book app. So that's out there in book apps. So this is what a typical MVC application might look like. And you'll notice over here I've got controllers, models, and views, as well as a bunch of other supporting code. But these are the main things. So the way these guys work is that you've got a well, let's run it. I think, like I said, it's not quite done. So this is one of the few times I'm actually going to ignore this and say, yeah, go ahead and run anyway. There's missing some. The application is not fully fleshed out, but we'll run the last good run. So I put some breakpoints in here earlier so I could point some stuff out, but let me just run it real quick to show it to you. So skip by those breakpoints. So there's the Halloween Superstore application. This is the home page. If I click order, it'll go to if it's implemented, the order page and the cart and contact us. So notice what it's doing up in the URL. It's using the routing that we've talked about in the past, where it's not asking for an ASPX page. That's the old web forms. It's simply going to different routes, and then the routes make a request to the controller to return a view. And if there's a model that's supporting the view, the controller will reach out to that model and pull back the data. So let's look at the context us as a for example. Go back to our code for a second. And let's look down here at the controllers. We'll look at the home controller. So this home controller is what's being mapped for everything on that home page. So you notice we've got two view results. We've got a excuse me. We've got the index for the home page. That's where we get our welcome text. And then we have a contact. That's that contact page. So let's put a breakpoint on that. And you'll notice that when we call home/contact, so we'll go ahead and hit enter on that, that controller gets that request and says, okay, I've got a view result called contact. So the name of this, the contact, actually matches the route that's being requested, contact. And then because they match, we'll come in here to this view result. We'll say, let's go, in this case, we're going to go look up the model data. In this case, it's actually a view model. So we'll go do that. We'll step in there and say, hey, go find that view model data, and then let's go return it. And then the data comes back and it's displayed. And then same thing for, like, say, order. Let's go find the order one just to do something different. We'll go to the order controller. And again, it's got a couple of action results. There's one for the home page. It's actually just two for the home page, right? One that expects a string ID and one that gets a whole collection of objects. So let's go ahead and do that. Put a breakpoint in here. And then click on order. So it looks like the first one's being sent. What what do we click when we clicked on it? If I looked at that URL, I could see the what was being sent or requested. But you can see, so we're going out, we're getting some data, we're getting the product list. It goes out to the product view model and it gets all the products, returns them, comes back, and then displays the data. So pretty simple, I think, at least from an overview standpoint. There's still a lot going on that we'll dig into. So we mentioned that there's different pages, the home, contact, order, and cart, and the different implementations, simple controller, simple view. The contact us was actually a strongly typed view, and we'll talk more about what that is in a minute. The order view actually handled both get and post requests. That's the two index methods that we saw. And then the cart view. So there's a little bit of everything for each one of these guys, giving you a little taste of the different implementations. So how do we create from scratch an MVC app? Basically, you create the app, you select the right template, and then you add a model, then a controller, and then views. So going to Visual Studio, give me a new MVC4 app. You select the MVC template. If you're using Visual Studio 2012, you'll actually get a choice of the old View Engine ASPX web forms or the new one, Razor. I'm actually using Visual Studio 2013, and so I don't get a choice. I just have to use Razor. And then there's this option to create unit tests, which is not checked off, but I'll check it off and show you what that does, because that's one of the benefits of creating an ASP.NET MVC is that it's testable. So let's actually go in and start one from scratch. So let's close this guy up. And I'll say I want to do a new project, and we're going to do an ASP.NET web app, and we'll call this MVC Demo 2. And we're going to do an MVC app. And we want tests. So we're going to say, yep, we want to add some unit tests. And it'll automatically create a second project used to test my MVC format. All right. So let me go in. I don't need authentication. We'll turn that off. And we're not going to host in the cloud just yet. So okay with that. All right. So this is our default code generated MVC app. You see we have controllers. One, the home controller. Some action results, index, about. So some default pages, contact. We don't get any models yet. We'll have to add models later. And then we get just a couple of views for the home. About. So for each one of the view results, we have a view page, and this is a little different. If we were using the old engine, you would see ASPX. Because we're using the new engine, we get this .cs HTML file, which is a Razor view engine. So let's look at one of those. Oh, we are. Okay. So this is it looks like HTML except for the little code block that's interjected in between the HTML. And that's what a Razor view engine allows us to do. We can actually inject code to help us generate the HTML. So let's run this and just see what the out-of-the-box MVC form looks like, web app form looks like. So there's my about, there's my home, there's my contact page. So notice as I click each one of these, again, I'm going to my controller over here. And I'm if I put breakpoints on these guys, I'm hitting one of these guys. And then, because I'm using the Razor view engine, I can actually go to the view engines and actually put breakpoints on the code inside the view engines. So let's see, what did I just hit? Contact, I think. So here's my contact controller, and I'm stepping into that, returning the view. Now I'm actually going to that Razor view, and you can see I'm setting the title there, and then actually returning the HTML that's generated from the Razor view. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Again, reviewing the folders and files produced by the basic template. It's got some of the usual stuff that we're used to as well, app data, global.ascx. We're going to talk more about this later, where that helps the whole mapping of the routes to the controller code. There's an app start folder that just houses your code that you want called on application startup. App data we know about already. There's content folders where we put style sheets and images. Then we talked about the controllers, models, and script or views folders. There's a script folder for if you're going to include JavaScript, and then your usual config files. I mentioned the global.ascx file. So again, reiterating, view engines are modules that take data sent by the controller, combine it with HTML, and then render it to the browser. Oh, you can have more than just the Razor view engine. I mentioned the old ASPX web forms was also an engine. That was the first one that was available. Now Razor's out, but you can replace them, come up with your own, or get a third-party engine. So it's designed to be interchangeable or pluggable. So where did the Razor view engine come from? Came out in 2010, and now it's the default. It's got this simple syntax that you can use to bind data from the controller to the HTML in the view, and that's what we were seeing earlier. If I switch back just a second, we were saying, hey, go get the view bag data and show me the title. Hey, from the view bag, go show me these are properties of that view bag object that came from the controller. So here's an example of some Razor syntax. I was looking at some. Hey, go look at the datetime class and show me the now.year property. This is a comment example. Here I'm using a for each loop, so I'm saying, hey, for each string. So you can see you can interject some, some looping, some interesting advanced logic. So if I want it, this is going through every social media URL in my model and making a table of them. So some advanced stuff you can do with the Razor syntax. This is showing us the register routes method in the route.config. This is in the app start directory. So go and we're saying, hey, this is the URL map that we want to map to, the URL pattern we want to map to, and I want you to call the home controller and the action index. And this is all default. So if I go to that app I just created and I look over at my global ASCX. This is the app start that runs every time we run our app. And then there's that register routes. If we go and look for that, you'll see that is in our root config file, which is under our app start directory. So there's our root config file. Whoops, there we go. And that just does that whole map route that we need for the URL request to map to the controller and the index method of the controller. The model subdirectory holds our models. We don't have any in my example just yet, but what we would do here is, presumably we've got some data that we want to present in our applications, and we would add a model, which was basically a class, to the models folder. And then when we do that, if you're doing all the data access layer yourself, you would then do, add data sources, whatever. But because we're using MVC and we want to be fancy, we can actually use one of the other models that might give us that's more adapted for MVC. So let me go and add. Let me go add a class. Let me stop debugging. So we'll go out here to our model, and we'll add a class. And I guess I could choose the this is what we've been working with before in ADO.NET, or this is actually Entity Framework. Let's actually choose. Let's do that. So we'll call this Halloween store or whatever. And we're going to, it's very similar to what we've done before in that we just get a little wizard and we point it at some data and tell it to, generate code to access that data. We're generating our data access layer here using the entity framework, and we'll use it. Basically, we're going to say, these choices say, hey, do you have a database already designed, or do you want to write the code first and then execute code to create the database? I've already got a database, so I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to start with my database first. So let's go create a new connection. We haven't created that yet. I'm going to use my SQL Server database file. Let's go find my Halloween database. It's out there in the app data directory. So I'm just pulling it off my C drive. It'll actually copy to my local project for me. Say, how's that look? Okie doke. Say OK. It generates my connection string for me. It says, hey, you pulled this off somewhere else on your C drive. Do you want it in your project? Yes, that would make sense. Put it in my app data folder for me. What version of the framework? I'll use the latest version, 6.0. Now, very similar to what we've done in previous data access models. I want all my tables. We'll go ahead and select everything. I don't have any views or store procedures in this particular database, but if I did, I could choose them. And we'll finish that. So now I've got, it warns me that one of my tables doesn't have a primary key, so it had to infer one, and now it's read-only. It won't do read-write unless it already has a primary key. We had that problem before. It's warning me it's generating some code. Do I trust it? The code? Sure, I trust everything. So there, it generated the entity framework database diagram. Kind of a nice little diagram to show me how my tables in my Halloween database are related. Looks like I've got a customer table that has a state lookup and an invoice relationship. So now that I have this model that I added to my MVC project, I can actually come in here and say, hey, let's use that model in a view, right? So let's add a controller for that model that will respond to it, and then we'll add a view, or we'll have the wizard generate views for us based on that model. So we'll come to our controller and say, hey, we want to add a controller for the model that we just added, and we'll use an MVC5 controller using the entity framework that we talked about. Sounds good. What class do we want to model? Well, let's see. Let's do customers, and we'll say, you know what? Go ahead, use our Halloween entities data model that we just added. And what else? I didn't create a layout page, so we'll leave that blank and say add. Okay, so it's saying, hey Dave, you're trying to add this model, but I don't think you compiled yet. Is really what it's saying. It's saying you haven't hit, you just did it, didn't you? Yes, I did. I didn't hit build. All right, let me build it first. Make sure everything's copacetic, get everything compiles okay. All right, now that I've done that, let me go re-add my controller. You think you'd be smart enough to do that for me, but okay. So there's I want an MVC5 controller, and I wanted to basically. I'm telling you, I also wanted not just to do the controller code, but I wanted to generate views too. So let's go ahead and add that. Do this again. Let's say we'll do customers. We'll use the Halloween entity we generated. I don't have a layout page, but let's go add that. And now I've got my controller, my customer's controller. You can see there's a default action result. There's a action result for someone sends me details and an ID to look up a certain customer. There's an action result for creating customers, for inserting customers. So it generated all the create, read, update, delete code for me in my controller. Not only did it do that, but because I selected with views, if I go down here to my view directory, it created a set of customer views for me. So there's one for create, delete, edit, details, and this, using the razor view. Now, we'll mention this in a second, but I'll point it out here. The views have this at model directive at the top. That makes these views strongly typed. So the view knows about the model, the data, the schema that it's been tied to. So in that, I can use what these are called. These are HTML helpers. So I can say, hey, I want you to display, that's my HTML helper, from the model, the last name. So I've got IntelliSense here. If I were typing these in myself and I hit model dot, it actually comes down with all the properties of the model. So it's showing me here last name, first name, but that it knows all these guys because of the model directive at the top that made this strongly typed view. So it's really helpful to have that from an IntelliSense standpoint. So let's run this and see what it actually looks like. Here's my application start. I put a few breakpoints on here so you guys could see some of the how it starts out. And it's saying, hey, you tried to jump right in the middle here, so let's start at the top. There we go. So there's my default page, and I've got a home about. So I didn't add a link. I need to go and add a link for my customers, but I can just type it in now, right? So home/customers. There's a customer. Whoops. What's my model here? Let's go find out. Stop debugging. So which controller do I want to run first? Let's see. We've got let's see up at the top here. Customers. That's right. Okay. Let me check my views here. There's the build. So when you're debugging, I can look at my views. You can see there's the browse to URL I was expecting. Let's run that. That's more like it. Okay, so here's my customer page. So you can see it pulls back all the customers from the database. If I go and look at the actual view that generated that page, that was this guy. So he came through here. It created the HTML helper action link, created a create new link up at the top to call the create controller. Down here we have just a table HTML class, and it uses these HTML helpers to build the column for each row. So that's where all the first name, last name, etc. But then we use a for each method to then repeat that row over and over again for every row in our database. And at the end we add a few more action links using our HTML helper. So that's where these are coming from. So I could click on that, and that's going to call the controllers for those pages with the so now we're looking at the edit view. Go back to the list. We can click create new, and we get a bunch of blank. And this again, this is the. If I go back to my source code, so there's a create view that's generating that create HTML page to insert a new customer. There's one for delete, details, edit. So it wasn't real difficult to get a complete. What happened there? Clicked the wrong button, maybe. I have to go debug that, but it's not too hard to. I didn't write a whole lot. Myself didn't write a whole lot of code to generate the application. I just right-clicked and said, add an entity framework model for my entities, and also generate some views. So now, if I wanted to, add a logo up here, brand the site a little bit, I would just go to the views and then start adding. For instance, let's add something to this index page. Let's stop debugging for a second. This is our customers index. Now that's our home. Let's go to customers index page. So if I had up here, I wanted to put my company name. I could come in here and do something like. Whoops. So I'm wondering, why it's giving me all this IntelliSense? Because I'm inside the body tag. I must have been. There we go. Let's just add welcome there and run that. And there, and that could have been a logo. Obviously, much more branding. Could use Cascade Style Sheet to add, to format and add some color. But you get the idea. All right. So we've gone over a lot of these slides already. I talked about adding the model, the view model, adding the controller, adding views. I didn't use the layout page, but you can have layout pages that would help define the views that get generated beforehand. Again, they use the same kind of razor engine, so I can still use my helpers and what else do we want to point out here? I mentioned strongly typed views are views that had that model directive. So again, if I go back to my code and I look at one of the views, the difference between a strongly typed view and a regular view. Let's see. So here's just a regular view, the About page. There's no model directive at the top, so there's no IntelliSense there's no model that's associated with. But if I go to a strongly typed view, I've got that. It says, hey, I belong to this customer model, so it knows that this view is going to display customer information, and I've got a model that I can pull that data from. These are some more. The book has more information about some of the different HTML helpers that you can call, and how the HTML that they generate. Redirection is available in MVC apps. So you can do redirection. You can set up an action link so people can move to a different link. There's also redirect to route, redirect to action, or just redirect to a URL. So your book has examples of those. Here's redirect to a specific URL. Here's redirect to a route, or redirect to an action. So you can use that to do things like the post redirect get pattern that we talked about earlier in one of the earlier chapters. If you use JavaScript and jQuery, you don't get your postback functionality like you do with the old ASP.NET form server controls. You could just say auto postback equal true. We don't have that in MVC. So one way to do it is to implement it using a class. So down here we can say, hey, I've got a class, and it's called auto postback. And then in my JavaScript file, I'll just say, hey, go find where, this is a selector. Go find that auto postback class. So the dot finds the class. Before I mentioned that the pound sign looks for an ID, but the dot is actually looking for a class name, and then go add this function, which will basically auto submit the that implements the auto postback functionality. Other things the book points out. This is just attributes that are decorating the different indexes. This is the get function. So this index is going to respond to an HTTP GET request because I put this attribute on it. And then this is saying, hey, this one is responding to an HTTP POST request. What else? More of the model binding that we talked about. And that's really it. So, again, no exercise in Chapter 24. They do recommend looking at what they've given you for the book application. Take a look at some of the code they generated. Play around with trying to add to it or modify it or brand it a little bit. Again, this chapter it's a real quick run through of all the features of MVC. There's way more material out there. There's a whole 5-day class, and I'll put up a link in the class site for some more information about it. But hopefully this gives you a taste for it and gives a starting foundation to further understanding MVC. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, or if you're in the live meeting, you can hit me up on the Q&A panel. Thanks.